Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm just going to walk you through the Canadian federal budget for 2016-2017. Basically, what I'm going to look at is basically if what if scenarios right now in terms of what's happening with revenue and expenses, and as they go through the budget cycle in terms of the approval process, to see what potentially is going to happen to the deficit, the debt level. This presentation is just my view. I've just crunched some of the numbers looking at the annual reports. It's not the only opinion on the finances for the country of Canada, but it gives you a good perspective where you can go dig and ask questions as the budget gets released. Here's a little bit about myself. I've spent 25 years in academia, industry, as well as financial solutions. So I've got a good handle in terms of public policy as well as how revenue is generated along with expense management. So my agenda will look at government revenue, government expenses, I'll talk about deficits, and I'll give you an outlook. So if we look generally on the government's financial statement of operations, we look at a revenue target of basically $282 billion, okay, which is growing at about 2% a year. So if we use the assumption that revenue will grow at 2%, we're seeing the new government revenue at about $5.6 billion. Now, I didn't factor in any tax increases or hikes. I've ignored that. I've just looked at strictly growth incentives. So if the Liberal government brings in a nationwide carbon tax or decides to hike the HST or look at corporate taxation rates or stuff like that, that will be outside the scope of what I looked at too, but that can be as part of the overall tax base that they look at. Now, that being said, what drives taxes? Well, consumer spending, exports, strong housing demand, and basically that drives the economic growth. So income tax revenue, excise tax, EI are all driven by economic growth. So let's talk about expenses, because this is where you're going to see a commitment. Now, the OAS adjustment won't come in play until 10 years out. And the reason why I say that is because the switch to move people from 67 back to 65 won't impact budgets now, but it will impact future budgets. That change will add an extra $4 billion in future budgets. So all the Liberal Party's done is delay that expense to future periods. EI, there's no discussion of raising premiums other than the cost of inflation, and I've factored that into my calculation. Military, there's still a commitment for capital spending, but they may pull back the military spending, and that you'll see that in the chart. I basically have pulled out $1 billion probably from the military budget. It could be a lot more. We'll see how it goes. Foreign aid. Now, the UN has a commitment since the 1970s that every country pays up to almost 1% of its gross national income. Canada's only done about a quarter of that. Trudeau and his government have already committed about $2.65 billion to poor countries for climate change. It's hard to tell if that's a one hit or an annual number. If it's an annual number, it's something you need to factor in, that the foreign aid is likely to go up. I got clean technology, $300 million, that's the commitment. It could be a higher number. Refugee settlements alone will cost about $1 billion, close to $1 billion in 2016. So you're going to see additional $200 to $400 million costs there. Promise of $5 billion in infrastructure, but that number could grow to about $8 to $10 billion. And we don't know about the new health corridor, new transfers for governments, how that's going to play in. They're committed to 2016-2017, so that's part of looking at the overall cost. So I budgeted or estimated out that the deficit for 2016-2017 is close to $18 billion. So what does structural deficit means? That means the government's got a revenue piece that they can no longer increase revenue, but they're spending more money they take in. So now they have a permanent issue of deficits. We've seen this in Spain, we've seen this in Greece, where you spend more money in, that becomes permanent. And then it forces you to make what we call as draconian measures that cut the expenses out or raise taxes. The scenario I'm giving you here is that you could see a government run deficits between $17.5 and $25 billion. I'm using different scenarios that bring that down. They're hoping a stronger economy, but the worldwide economy is not going to grow that quick. So to depend on the economy growing, favorable assumptions on that's probably not going to happen. So you can probably project out that you're likely going to see some sort of tax hikes And if you look at the options available, HST would bring in an extra $5 billion a year. So if they were to hike that by 2%, it would bring $10 billion more in income in. Now that being said, it pushes the price of goods up, which impacts the middle class, and that's not discussed. Corporate taxes, an increase in a point would bring in an extra $1.1 to $1.5 billion in new revenue. So if you brought that in and hiked that in, again, that pushes up the cost because the businesses would also basically add that cost. Or it also would discourage business making investment in Canada because they would rule Canada is not a favorable environment to invest in. If you look at the transfers itself are capped at overall healthcare is about 4%, but they're capped right now. The new government has to sign an accord, and that accord has to come into play, and that'll in fact not this budget as much, but future budgets. Infrastructure, there's a commitment to spend billions of dollars over 10 years. They could scale that back. So what's this really say? Well, you're going to get different people specify different quotes. I picked 3 quotes, different ones. The TD and Scotiabank support a stimulus. Now the stimulus has to make sense, and that's what you're getting with the Doug Porter from basically BMO saying that you can't kickstart an economy when you have slow growth worldwide. So you have to be very tactical how you spend money, and that's what they're getting at. So what does this really mean overall? These deficits could become structural, and that becomes a point where strategic decisions have to be made on government on raising taxes or cutting expenses. Today's deficit and debts are tomorrow's taxes. That's a statement that's constantly known. And we're going through a slow period of economic growth. Okay, that means basically no matter how much you stimulate an economy, if there isn't worldwide demand, it won't matter. We have no transparency in foreign aid, so we don't even know if foreign aid gets to the right people and its benefit. The UN needs to stand up to that, the more transparency. Clean technologies, it's nice to talk about it, and it's a viable technology to look at, but it takes years to commercialize. Infrastructure investments, you have to kind of have a strategic decision how you make infrastructure investments, and that means from exports, means looking at port expansion, pipeline expansion, different things to move goods to market. You also have to look at business cases with transit projects. It's not just to say I'm going to make a transit project. Is it profitable? Is it viable? There are other issues of infrastructure like wastewater treatment plants, but we have to look at the model itself. We can't just throw money at a problem, at the symptoms, because the causes never go away. So you have to have a strategic decision how you spend money. Now this is just a quick summary of what's going to happen. I don't know what's in the budget, but based on some of the statements made by government leaders and different people, there is a potential that we could see multi-year deficits, and then beyond the $6 and $7.5 billion range, up to $15 to $25 billion range. Easily that could be seen happening right now. The key is how do they bring those deficits down over a 3 or 4 year period? Because typically with deficits, you can't take that much money out of an economy without having an impact. You have to hope the private sector has enough slack that it can absorb that. So this is a key idea that when you're starting to talk to people, to really understand that deficits are not always a good thing. You also have to make sure you make strategic investments, true, but you also have to make sure that you're not leaving a legacy of future cuts. Thank you.